For 7 months, Dominic Vale looked for his wife. He was 37 years old. He ran the freight moving through the port of Boston behind a shipping company nobody asked too many questions about, and there wasn't a man in that city he couldn't find inside a weekend. His own wife, he couldn't find at all. She'd walked out of a house with 12 cameras on it and left nothing behind. No note, no bag, no reason. Every week his men came back and told him they'd turned up nothing, and every week he sent them out again. He kept paying the bill on a phone that never switched on, and he waited. Then, at 7 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday, the 6th of October, on a sidewalk in Chelsea, he saw her. Elena was 27, and she looked a good deal older than that, now thin through the face, a jacket far too light for the weather, a cardboard box tucked under one arm, and she was pregnant. Far along. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elena did the one thing nobody in Boston would dare do in front of that man. She ran. She got 10 steps before her legs gave out, and he caught her before she hit the pavement. And when she lifted her head, the woman who'd slept beside him every night for 3 years looked at him the way you'd look at a stranger somebody had warned you about. 7 months of silence, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't anger. It was fear. Stay with us to the end, because the reason she ran isn't the one you're expecting. If this story pulls you in, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who still appreciates a story worth sitting still for. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's head back to that sidewalk in Chelsea. The morning shift started at 6:30, and Elena Marsh had been on her feet since 5:15, because it took 2 buses to get from the room she rented in Revere to the diner on Broadway in Chelsea, and the second bus didn't wait for anybody. She was 35 weeks along. The baby had dropped a week earlier, low and heavy, and every step she took now came with a dull pressure across her hips that never fully let go. She'd learned to work around it. She kept her orders small, 4 plates at a time instead of 6, and she'd stopped carrying the coffee pot in her left hand because her left wrist had started to swell by the 3rd hour. Nobody at the diner asked her about any of it. That was the arrangement, unspoken but understood, and she'd honored her half of it for 4 months without a single complaint. She poured refills and wiped down booths and smiled at the regulars who came in for eggs and the newspaper, and when a man at the counter asked her when she was due, she said November and left it at that. She never said anything more than she had to. She hadn't for 7 months. At 8:20, carrying a bus tray loaded with breakfast dishes back toward the kitchen, she misjudged the width of her own body. It was that simple. Her belly caught the corner of the service counter. Just a nudge, hardly more than a bump, but it was enough to knock the tray off balance, and she felt it going and couldn't do a thing about it, because her hands were already full and her feet were already slow. The tray went down. 9 plates, 2 mugs, and a water glass, and the sound it made in a room full of people eating breakfast was the kind of sound that stops every conversation at once. She stood there for a second. Then she got down on her knees, which took her a great deal longer than it would have taken anyone else in that room, and she started picking up the pieces with her bare hands. Nobody helped her. The manager came out from the back and stood over her while she worked, and he didn't say anything until she'd gotten the last of the big pieces into the tray and pulled herself up on the edge of the counter. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd hired her without asking for references, and he'd been decent to her in the small ways that don't cost anything. He looked at the floor and not at her when he finally spoke. "Elena, I can't keep you on." She didn't answer. "It's the 3rd one this month," he said. "Insurance, liability, all of it. You understand." She understood. She also understood, and so did he, that what he was doing was against the law in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that a pregnant woman couldn't be let go for being pregnant, that there were people whose whole job was to make sure of it. She could see him knowing it. It moved across his face while he stood there, and he swallowed it down the way a man swallows something he's decided not to think about again, and then he reached into his back pocket and handed her an envelope he'd clearly put together before she ever dropped that tray. She took it. She said, "Thank you for the work." That was all she said. She didn't argue, and she didn't cry, and she didn't tell him about the room in Revere or the $950 due on the 1st, because she'd figured out a long time ago that begging didn't move people. It only made them look away faster. She went to the back, put her things in a cardboard box somebody had left by the walk-in, and came out through the dining room past the tables of people who had already gone back to their breakfasts. The envelope held $214. She counted it standing on the sidewalk. 2 blocks up, past the laundromat, there was a pawn shop with iron grating over the windows. And she went inside because it was the only thing left to try. She set the ring on the glass counter. It was a plain band, nothing showy, and the man behind the counter turned it under the lamp for a while without saying a number. He said, "Where'd you get this?" And she said it was hers, and he looked at her a second longer than she liked, and then he named a figure that would have covered the rent and left something over for the bus. She looked at the ring lying there on the glass. She looked at it for what felt like a long time. Then she reached out, closed her hand around it, and put it back in her coat pocket. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've changed my mind." She walked out and started up Broadway toward the bus stop with the box under one arm, taking it slow, because slow was all she had. And that was when 3 black cars came up the far side of the street and pulled in against the curb. He held her the way you'd hold something that might come apart in your hands, one arm under her shoulders and the other braced across her back. And he didn't try to lift her. He waited until her breathing evened out. The cardboard box had gone over in the street, and a paperback and a hairbrush and a folded apron lay scattered across the asphalt, and none of his men moved to pick any of it up because none of them had been told to. Elena got her feet under her. She pulled her arm free of him, not hard, just deliberately, and she straightened up as much as a woman 35 weeks along can straighten up, and she stood there on that sidewalk in Chelsea with her hand pressed flat against the underside of her belly. "Elena Vale," he said. She looked at him then. "I never took that name," she said. He didn't answer. He stood there in the middle of Broadway with the traffic going by and 3 cars idling at the curb and 11 men waiting on him, and he had nothing to say, because she was right, and he hadn't known it. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of her signature on lease agreements and tax filings, and the card that came with the flowers he sent every anniversary, and he'd never once looked at it closely enough to notice what it actually said. She'd never changed a thing. She'd told him so on the day they signed the license, in a sentence so small he'd forgotten it inside a week, and she'd been Elena Marsh the entire time he'd been calling her something else. He bent down and gathered the things off the street. He put the paperback back in the box, and the hairbrush on top of it, and the apron folded over both, and he handed it to her, and she took it. "Where are you living?" he asked. She didn't want to tell him. He could see that plainly, and he didn't push, and he didn't fill the silence with anything. He just waited, and after a while she said, "Revere." And then, because there was no point in halves, she gave him the street. She started walking toward the bus stop. She made it maybe 15 yards before she stopped and put a hand on the side of a parked van and stood there with her head down. And he came up beside her without touching her at all. "Let me drive you," he said. "That's it, nothing else." She got in the car. Not because she wanted to, because her hips had gone from pressure to something sharper somewhere around the 2nd block, and because she'd been up since 5:15, and because 2 buses across the bridge with a cardboard box in her arms wasn't a thing her body was going to do that morning. She sat against the door with the box on her lap and looked out the window the whole way, and he sat on the other side of the seat and asked her nothing. 22 minutes. He counted them. The building was 3 stories of brown vinyl siding on a street of buildings just like it, and her entrance wasn't the front door but a set of concrete steps going down along the side, under the level of the sidewalk, to a door with a padlock hasp screwed into the frame above the knob. He told the cars to stay where they were. He told the men to stay where they were. Then he went down the steps behind her by himself. She unlocked the door and went in and set the box on the floor and turned around to face him, and she didn't apologize for any of it, and she didn't explain. The room was maybe 12 feet by 15, with a mattress on a metal frame and a hot plate on a card table, and one window up near the ceiling that looked out at the tires of parked cars. There was a crib against the far wall, secondhand, one rail sanded down where somebody's old paint had been stripped off, a folded towel laid across the mattress because there wasn't a sheet on it yet. He stood in the doorway a long moment, then he crossed the room and opened the refrigerator, and he didn't know why he did it, and he stood there looking into it. A half-gallon of milk, 4 eggs in a carton meant for a dozen, a jar of peanut butter, a plastic container of something from a food pantry with a date written on the lid in marker. He shut the door. He'd spent 7 months telling himself a story about where she was. In the story, she was somewhere warm and somewhere safe, somewhere with money in it, because she'd left of her own free will, and a woman who leaves of her own free will has a place to go. He'd needed that story badly enough that he'd never tested it. And here it was, 12 feet by 15, with a food pantry container in the refrigerator, and a crib somebody else's baby had used first, and there was nobody in that room to be angry at, and nobody to send anybody after, and no order he could give that would take a single day of it back. He turned around. Elena was standing by the card table with her coat still on, watching him look at her life. "You can sit down," she said. "Or you can go. But I'm not answering anything standing up." He sat down on the folding chair by the card table, and she lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Then she reached under the frame and pulled out a manila envelope with the flap worn soft from handling, and she set it on the table in front of him. "You want to know where I've been," she said. "Start there." He opened it. The first thing out was a prenatal record from a clinic, a folded stack of carbon copies with blood pressure readings and fundal measurements going back 4 months, and across the top of every page, printed, and then initialed, and then printed again, was the name Elena Marsh, 27 years old, no insurance listed. He read it twice. Not the numbers. The name. He'd heard her say it out loud on the sidewalk an hour ago, and it had gone through him like a stone dropped down a well. And here it was again in a stranger's handwriting, in a file cabinet, in a town she'd never mentioned to him, being used by people who'd only ever known her that way. Nobody had corrected it. Nobody had ever needed to. The second thing was a billing statement from a free clinic in Lynn, and the balance column at the bottom read $0.00, because the clinic didn't charge, because it was the kind of place a woman goes when she has $214 and a room to pay for. He set it down beside the first. The third thing was different. It was a court document, and he knew what it was before he'd finished the first line, because the caption at the top of the page had both their names on it: Complaint for Divorce, Suffolk County Probate and Family Court, filed the 11th of May. He turned it over slowly, the way a man turns over a card he already knows is bad. There was an affidavit attached. There was a certificate of service attached. And at the bottom of the last page, in blue ink, on the line marked for the plaintiff, there was her signature. He looked at it for a long time. Then he held the page up so she could see it. "Did you sign this?" "No. Have you ever seen it before?" "It came in the mail in June," she said. "To a post office box I'd opened under a different name. I'd had that box for 6 weeks." She said it flatly, the way a person says a thing they've already been afraid of for months and has worn the fear down smooth. "That's how I knew somebody was following me. Not because they came, because they wrote to me." He set the page down on the table and put 2 fingers on the signature line and didn't lift them. 5 months, filed the 11th of May, and he'd never been served a thing. No summons had come to the house on Prince Street, with the 12 cameras on it. No process server had walked up his drive. No attorney had called him. And Catherine Boyle, who'd handled every piece of paper with his name on it for 11 years, had never once mentioned the words probate and family court in his presence. A complaint like that doesn't end a marriage. It doesn't do anything, on its own, except open a file, and the file sits there in the clerk's office, with a docket number attached to it, and a status that reads pending, and every record system in the Commonwealth that touches that docket number reads the same word back: pending, unsettled. Not quite one thing, and not quite the other. Whoever filed it hadn't been trying to divorce them. They'd been trying to put a question mark where a fact used to be. "Somebody wanted this on record," he said. Elena didn't answer. She was watching his hands. He looked at the 3 pages laid out on the card table side by side, and something in his chest went slowly, quietly cold, because he was starting to see the shape of the thing, and the shape of it was all wrong. A woman running from her husband hides. She uses cash. She stays away from clinics that keep records. She doesn't open a post office box under any name at all. And a husband looking for that woman finds her. Or at the very least he finds the paper she leaves behind. And he'd had 11 men and 7 months, and every account and record system in the city of Boston bent toward exactly that one purpose. He'd found nothing, and in the same 7 months, somebody else had found her prenatal file, her post office box, and her signature, close enough to copy it well enough that a clerk had accepted it across a counter without blinking. That wasn't luck. That wasn't a mistake. 2 people had been looking for the same woman, and only one of them had ever come close, and it wasn't him. He sat back in the folding chair and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and when he spoke, his voice had gone very quiet. "Elena," he said, "there's been someone standing between us for 7 months, and I don't know who it is." The light through the little window near the ceiling had gone flat and gray by the time he asked her, and he asked it plainly, without working up to it. Why did you run? Elena didn't answer right away. She got up off the mattress, slower than she wanted to, and went to the coat hanging on the back of the door, and from the inside pocket she took out a phone. Not a phone he'd ever bought her. A cheap plastic thing with a scuffed screen and a rubber case gone yellow at the corners, the kind sold behind the register at a convenience store for $30, with a card of minutes taped to the box. She held it a moment. Then she sat back down on the edge of the mattress, thumbed through it without looking up, and set it on the card table between them. Because of this, she said, and pressed play. There was 3 seconds of nothing. A room tone, a faint hum, the sound of a space with hard surfaces in it. Then a voice. His voice. He knew it the way anyone knows their own recorded voice, which is to say he hated the sound of it, and it was unmistakably his. The flat Boston vowels he'd never lost, and the particular way he clipped the ends of his sentences when he was finished with a conversation. Cut the tail off. I don't want to hear the name Marsh again. Then the recording stopped. The room was very quiet. Elena sat with her hands folded on top of her belly and looked at him, and she wasn't crying. That was the part that got into him. He'd braced for tears somewhere in the last 3 hours, and they hadn't come once. Not on the sidewalk, not on the drive, not with the divorce complaint lying on the table with her forged name at the bottom of it, and they didn't come now either. She was cold all the way through, and cold was worse, because cold meant she'd finished with something a long time ago, and had simply been waiting for the chance to say so out loud. Play it again, he said. She played it again. Again. She played it a 3rd time. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and he listened to himself say 11 words in a voice he'd been carrying around in his throat his entire life, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd pass, the thing in his chest turned over, because he'd found it. It was small. It was smaller than a heartbeat. There was a seam. Between the 4th word and the 5th, the room behind his voice changed. It was nothing you'd catch the 1st time, or the 2nd time, and probably nothing you'd catch at all if you weren't a man whose life had trained him to hear the half-second where a lie gets stitched to a truth. He lifted his head. This is my voice, he said. I said this. I said these words. He watched her face take the blow without moving. But I said them 4 years ago, in Gloucester, about a different man, and I never once said the name Marsh in that room. Elena looked back at him for a long moment. You'd say that either way. I would, he agreed. So don't take it from me. Take it from the tape. She didn't argue with him. She didn't agree with him either. She reached over and turned the phone face down on the table, the way you'd cover something you didn't want to keep looking at. And she said the next part very evenly. Danny died on the 9th of September, 2 years ago. Everett. They found him on the side of Route 16 at 4 in the morning, and the report said hit and run, and the file went cold in 11 weeks, because there wasn't a camera on that stretch, and nobody stopped. She paused. You came to the wake. You stood next to me. You held my hand at the cemetery in Malden, and you told me you'd find whoever did it. I remember. So did I, she said. Every day for 7 months I've remembered it, and every day I've wondered which part of you was standing there. He let that sit, because there wasn't a single thing he could say to it that wouldn't sound like a man defending himself, and a man defending himself is the last thing a woman like that listens to. Instead, he asked her the only question that mattered. Who sent it to you? I don't know. Elena, I don't know, she said again. It came to the house. 9 days before I left. A padded envelope, no return address, postmarked Boston, and inside there was that phone with the recording already loaded on it and 1 sheet of paper. She reached into the coat pocket again and came back with the paper, folded into quarters, gone soft as cloth. She held it out to him. He unfolded it. There was no letter on it. There were no words on it at all. There was a single line of type across the middle of the page, an 8-character string, a letter, and then 7 digits. And he sat looking at it for so long that Elena finally spoke. It's the incident number, she said. Danny's case file. Everett Police Department. Then she took the paper back out of his hands, folded it along the same soft creases, and said the last thing quietly. That number was never released to the public. Not to me. Not to the papers. Not to anybody. There were exactly 4 people in this world who could have gotten it, and every one of them sits down to dinner in your mother's house. He didn't take her to the house on Prince Street. He took her north instead, 40 miles up the coast to a gray shingled place at the end of a gravel road in Gloucester. 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that looked out over water the color of dishwater in October. a house his father had bought in 1988 and never once used for anything but sitting still. Elena walked through it slowly on the morning of the 7th, one hand at the small of her back, and when she'd seen all of it, she came back to the kitchen and laid out her terms before she'd agree to spend a night under that roof. She held up one finger. No locks, not on the outside of any door in this house. I want to be able to walk out of here at any hour and have nobody standing between me and the road. He nodded. Second finger. You don't take my phone, not to check it, not to trace it, not to keep it safe for me. It stays in my pocket. He nodded again. Third finger. She looked at him a beat longer before she said this one, and nobody sits outside my bedroom door. Not one of your men. Not on a chair in the hallway, not in a car in the driveway with a view of that window. If I wake up at 2 in the morning, I want the hallway empty. He didn't answer that as quickly. There was a whole argument sitting in his mouth about a woman 35 weeks along in a house at the end of an unlit road, about who'd already found her once, and how easily, and he could have made all of it, and probably won. He said, "Done." That was all. He didn't ask her for anything in return, and she noticed that he didn't, and neither of them said a word about it. Nico Ferrara came up from Boston at 10:30. Elena was standing at the counter with a glass of water in her hand when he came through the kitchen door, and Nico stopped. Not long, half a second, maybe less, the pause of a man stepping into a room and finding it rearranged. Then it was gone, and he crossed the floor and said, "Elena, it's good to see you," in the voice of somebody who'd said that sentence 100 times at wakes and christenings. And she said, "Nico," and set the glass down. And there was a small dead spot in the air, where more should have followed and didn't. Neither of them looked at the other again for the rest of the morning. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Dominic laid it out. The recording. The seam between the 4th word and the 5th. The 8-character string on the folded paper. He didn't say the sentence he'd said in that basement room, the one about 4 people and a dinner table, because he'd decided somewhere on the drive up that he wasn't going to say it out loud again until he had something in his hands that couldn't be argued with. "I want to know who filed that complaint in May," he said. "The clerk's office in Suffolk County takes filings over the counter and by mail. Somebody handed it in or somebody sent it. Either way, a human being touched it. I want a name." Nico had a small notebook out, and he was writing. "And the tape? The tape needs somebody who knows audio, not one of ours. That's a short list." "Then make it a short list." Nico kept writing. He asked good questions, the way he always did, and he asked them in the right order. And he wrote down the answers in the same small, square handwriting he'd used since he was 19 years old. When it came to the part about the post office box in Elena's other name, he wrote that down too, and he asked her which town, and she told him, and he thanked her. Then he closed the notebook and said, "7 months I've been running this. I'll keep running it." Dominic put a hand on his shoulder on the way past and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. Catherine Boyle arrived at 1 o'clock, a woman of 54 who'd been the family's attorney for 30 years, and who parked her own car and carried her own bag. She read the divorce complaint, standing up, all the way through, twice. And then she put it down on the kitchen table and looked at Dominic. "I want to be certain I understand you. You want me to go into the clerk's office and pull the intake record on this docket?" "Yes." "And then you'd like the name of whoever brought it in?" "That's right." "No," Catherine said. Dominic looked at her. "I'll pull the docket," she said. "I'll pull the intake sheet, the affidavit of service, the whole file, and I'll do it under my own name and in my own way, and I will hand you what's in it. What I won't do is get you a name so you can go stand in front of somebody's house at 11 at night. If you want this to hold up in front of a judge, and Dominic, you are going to need it to hold up in front of a judge, then it goes the slow way, my way, or you can find another lawyer, and God help you." Nobody in that kitchen had said no to him in 11 years. He sat back down and said, "The slow way, then." There had been a Sunday dinner in the house on Prince Street every week for 31 years, and on the 11th of October, Elena Marsh walked into it for the first time in 7 months. Vivian Kessler came out of the kitchen with a dish towel still in her hands and stopped dead in the doorway, and then she crossed that room faster than a woman of 59 ought to move and put both arms around Elena and held on. She was crying before she'd gotten a word out. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "Oh, look at you." She pulled back and held Elena at arm's length and looked at her, at the shape of her, and put a hand flat against the side of her belly, with the towel still hanging off her wrist. "Look at you." Elena stood very still and let herself be held. Vivian had been the second wife of Arthur Vale Sr. for 20 years, and she'd never once in all that time raised her voice inside that house, and she'd sat with Elena at the kitchen table after Danny's funeral and hadn't said a single useless thing. 7 months, Vivian said. 7 months, and not one of us knew, and you were carrying this the whole time. That's a miracle. That is a miracle sitting right there, and I don't care what anybody says. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and laughed at herself for it. She sat Elena down. She brought her water without being asked and put a cushion behind her back. And halfway through the meal, she reached over and took Elena's hand and said, "Now listen to me. The hospital, the doctors, all of it. That's mine. I want it in my name, and I want it settled by Wednesday. Brigham or Mass General, whichever you like. And I'll have somebody make the calls tomorrow morning and get you a proper obstetrician and not whoever's on rotation." Elena started to say something, and Vivian squeezed her hand and cut her off. Gently. "No, don't. You've done 7 months of this by yourself, and that's 7 months more than anyone should have to. Let somebody carry a little of it." At the far end of the table, Dominic said nothing at all, and watched and ate almost nothing. It was Catherine Boyle who changed the temperature of that room, and she did it without meaning to. At 8:30, when the plates had been cleared, and she opened her bag and set a bound document on the table. "While we're all here," she said, "there's a matter I'd rather not raise twice. Arthur Vale Sr. had died on the 3rd of November, 3 years earlier, and he'd left the freight business to his son and something else entirely to everybody else." Catherine turned the document around, so it faced the middle of the table. "The Vale Family Foundation," she said. $180 million. She didn't dress it up. She said what it actually was, in the plainest words she had, because she'd learned a long time ago that people stop listening the moment a lawyer starts sounding like one. It paid hospital bills for longshoremen who got hurt on the piers. It paid a monthly check to men who'd been crushed or fallen or lost a hand and couldn't go back, and to their widows after. It paid tuition, 4 years of it, for their kids. More than 4,000 families across South Boston and Charlestown and Chelsea got something from that fund every single year, and most of them had never heard the name Vale in their lives and had no idea where the money came from. "Vivian has chaired it since Arthur died," Catherine said. "As interim chair. That's the word in the instrument. Interim." Vivian folded her napkin and set it beside her plate and said nothing. "There's a provision," Catherine went on. "Arthur put it in 11 months before he died. The interim chairmanship converts to permanent at midnight on the 3rd of November, 3 years to the day. After that, the chair sits for life and appoints her own successor, and no court in the Commonwealth will unwind it." She paused. "Unless, on that date, there exists a living, lineal heir of Dominic Vale. If there is, control of the foundation passes to the child's parent as trustee, and the whole thing goes to an independent audit inside 90 days. The room had gone very quiet. Elena had her hand resting on top of her belly, and she didn't move it. 23 days, Dominic said. "That's right. And the baby's due when?" Catherine looked at Elena, and Elena answered it herself, because she'd known the answer since a clinic in Lynn had written it on a carbon copy 4 months ago, and she'd been looking at that date ever since. The 8th of November. Nobody said anything for a moment. 5 days. Not 5 months. Not 5 years. 5 days on the wrong side of a line that a man had drawn in a lawyer's office 3 years before there was any child to draw it for. And every one of them at that table did the arithmetic at the same time and arrived at the same place. Vivian was the first to speak. She reached over and put her hand on Elena's arm, and her eyes had filled up again. "Then it doesn't matter," she said. "Do you hear me? It doesn't matter one bit. That baby is not a date on a piece of paper. Arthur would be ashamed of us if we sat here and looked at her like a deadline. And she meant it. Everyone at that table would have sworn she meant it. They were most of the way back to Gloucester, somewhere past Beverly with the road empty in both directions, when Elena said, "There's something I never told you." He didn't take his eyes off the windshield. "All right. The night before I left," she said, "I copied the foundation books." He slowed without meaning to. "You what?" "I'd been in and out of those ledgers for 2 years. Arthur put me in that office himself. And after he died, nobody thought to take me out of it. So I still had everything. Payments, grants, transfers, the disbursement schedules going back 9 years. She was looking out her window at nothing. The night that envelope came, I stopped sleeping. And when a person stops sleeping, they start reading. 9 days later, I copied all of it onto a drive, and I put the drive somewhere in that house, and then I walked out the side door at 4 a.m. Where? Your mother's music box. He didn't answer for a moment. The one in the study. The one in the study, she said. On the shelf behind your desk. The walnut one with the brass hinge that doesn't sit flush. She turned and looked at him for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. In 3 years, I never once saw a person in that house so much as dust it. Not the cleaners, not your men, not Vivian. You told me the first week I lived there. Nobody touches that box. He turned the car around at the next exit. It was 10 minutes past midnight when they came back through the front door on Prince Street, and the house had gone dark and quiet, and Vivian's room was at the far end of the second floor with the door closed. Dominic didn't turn on the hall lights. They went into the study and he shut the door behind them and switched on the small lamp on the desk. And Elena stood just inside the doorway with one hand on the frame, breathing slower than she'd have liked, because 11 flights of nothing and 1 flight of stairs had become the same thing to her body somewhere around week 33. The box was on the shelf, where it had been for 30 years. It had belonged to his mother, and she'd died when he was 9, and it was the one object in a house full of expensive things that had never been appraised, moved, or mentioned. He took it down with both hands. It was heavier than people expected. He set it on the desk under the lamp and stood there a second with his fingers on the lid, and then he opened it. The little cylinder inside turned twice, and the tines picked out 4 notes of something before it slowed and stopped, the way it always did, because the spring had gone soft sometime in the 1970s, and nobody had ever had it fixed. The drive wasn't there. Elena came off the doorframe. It was under the tray, she said. There's a felt tray. You lift it out. It sits in the well underneath. I know where it sits. He lifted the felt tray with 2 fingers and set it on the desk. There was one thing in the well underneath. It was a photograph, printed on thermal paper, curled slightly at the corners the way that paper always curls. An ultrasound image. 9 weeks. The date was printed along the bottom edge in small gray type, the 16th of June, and beside it the name of a clinic in Lynn, and beside that, the patient, Elena Marsh. Neither of them said a word. He didn't pick it up right away. He stood with both hands flat on the desk on either side of it, and looked at it under the lamp. And Elena came the rest of the way across the room, and looked at it too, and after a while she reached out and touched the edge of it, and then took her hand back. There was nothing else in the box. No note, no message, no threat, no line of type, nothing written on the back of the photograph, no word left behind of any kind. Just a picture that had been printed at a free clinic 17 miles north of that room, on a June afternoon, and handed across a counter to a woman who'd paid nothing for it, and gone home with it in her coat pocket, and never shown it to another living soul. Somebody had taken the drive out of that box, and they had put this in its place, and closed the lid, and put the box back on the shelf, and gone downstairs and eaten Sunday dinner. He understood it all at once, and it went through him like cold water. Whoever had done this had known where she was in June. 4 months before he'd stood on a sidewalk in Chelsea and caught her before she hit the pavement. 4 months in which they could have walked up those concrete steps in Revere any night of the week and knocked on that door, and they hadn't. They hadn't needed to. A woman hiding in a basement room in Revere with $200 to her name was a woman who couldn't do anything to anybody. They'd simply watched her and let her stay lost, and waited. He looked up at the closed study door, and at the dark hallway beyond it, and at the stairs going up. He'd spent 5 days looking for a man out there in the city of Boston. There wasn't one. Whoever had done this slept under his own roof. On the 13th of October, Dominic Vale waited 2 hours and 10 minutes in the lobby of an accounting firm in the seaport, because he'd called ahead and been told no, and had come anyway. Theo Lindquist came down at 6:10 with his coat already on. He was 28. He did forensic accounting for a firm that got hired when money went missing, and he hadn't spoken to anyone in that family in 4 years. He stopped 6 feet away and didn't offer his hand. You should have saved yourself the trip. 10 minutes. You're going to ask me about my mother? Yes. Then it's a no. He started for the revolving door, and Dominic said, Somebody put a recording in my wife's hands with my voice on it. It's been spliced. I need a man who can look at a set of books and tell me what he sees, and who won't be told what to see. Theo laughed, once, without any humor in it at all. That's a nice speech. It's not a speech. It's a speech. And I've heard the family version of it since I was 8 years old. And I'll tell you exactly what I told the last person who came at me with one. He turned back around. You and my mother are two sides of the same coin. You're the side people are afraid of. She's the side people thank. He said it without heat, which made it worse. She hands out a scholarship in June, and everybody in that room stands up. You put a man out of business in June and nobody says a word. Neither one of you has ever in your life had to hear the word no from somebody who could make it stick. You just do it differently. That may be true. It is true. Then help me prove one of us did something. Theo shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's already decided and just hasn't gotten to the door yet. You know why my name is Lindquist? Dominic didn't answer. Arthur offered to adopt me when I was 8, Theo said. Sat me down at that table in the study and asked me, like a grown person. And I said yes. I wanted it so bad my ears were ringing. And my mother took me upstairs afterward and sat on the end of my bed and told me she'd thought about it, and it was better if I kept my own name. She said, You keep the name you came in with, honey. That way, if you ever need to walk out of here, you can. He let that sit for a second. I was 8. She was planning my exit when I was 8. He shrugged one shoulder. So you'll forgive me if I don't get sentimental about that house. Dominic stood there in the lobby of that building with the cleaners moving around them and the elevators chiming behind, and he understood that he was going to lose this, and that Catherine had been right about the slow way, and that he had 21 days. He said the only thing he had left. It isn't about the house, it's the foundation. Theo's hand stopped on the door. What about it? $180 million in the workers' fund, Dominic said. The hospital money, the disability checks, the tuition. Catherine read the instrument out loud at the table on Sunday, and I sat there and listened to her, and I don't think anyone in that room but me heard what she actually said. Chairmanship converts at midnight on the 3rd of November. After that, it's hers for life, and she names who comes next, and nobody audits any of it, ever. Theo turned around. He didn't come back across the lobby. He stood by the door with his hand still on it, and his face had changed in a way that had nothing to do with Dominic at all. Say the numbers again. 4,000 families, give or take. No, say the amount. 180 million. Theo looked at the floor for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter and flatter, the voice of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer he keeps getting. Arthur used to take me down to the piers, he said. Saturdays. He'd walk the whole length of Conley and shake hands like a man running for something, and he'd introduce me. This is Theo. Not my wife's boy, not the kid who lives with us. This is Theo. And on the way home, he'd tell me the same thing every single time, that the money in that fund wasn't Vale money. It was theirs. We were just holding it for them. He looked up. He was the only one in that house who ever treated me like I belonged to it, and he never once tried to make me take the name. Dominic said nothing. You understand I'm not doing this for you. I don't care why you do it. I want that on the record between us, because I'm going to say it once, and then never again. Theo came back across the lobby and stopped in front of him. If I look at those books and there's nothing there, I walk out and I never hear from you again as long as I live. And if there is something there, I don't hand it to you. I don't hand it to the family. I don't hand it to your lawyer. I don't hand it to anybody who's going to sit on it and negotiate with it. It goes where it's supposed to go. Agreed. You say that easy. I know I do, Dominic said. Ask me again in 3 weeks. Theo held out his hand. It was the first time in 20 years that either of them had touched the other. Send me the audio first, he said. The books take time. A splice doesn't. Theo called on the morning of the 14th, before 8, and he didn't say hello. There are 2 splices, not 1. He'd sat with it most of the night. Every room a voice is recorded in leaves its own signature underneath the words. A low bed of hum and air and the particular way sound comes back off the walls, and that bed runs continuous unless somebody cuts into it. This one didn't run continuous. It stopped and started twice, in the same 11 seconds, and in the second half, the room behind the voice was smaller and harder, and there was a faint, 60-cycle hum riding under it that wasn't there in the first half. Different rooms, Theo said. Different years, probably. Whoever built this had raw material to work with, and they had a lot of it. That's not a man with a laptop and a grudge. That's someone who'd been recording you for a long time and had a library. Dominic stood in the kitchen in Gloucester, with the phone against his ear, and looked out at the water. How long? Years. I'd want somebody who does this for a living to say it in front of a judge. But yes, years. Then Theo went into the books, and for 2 days nobody heard from him. He came up to Gloucester on the 16th with a laptop and a printed stack under his arm, and sat down at the kitchen table. And Elena sat across from him with a glass of water, and Dominic stood, because he couldn't do anything else. Theo turned the first page around. "The foundation is clean on its face," he said. "That's the first thing you should know. Every dollar that's supposed to go out goes out. Nobody's missed a tuition payment. Nobody's missed a disability check. If you audited the disbursements, you'd find them perfect. Then what am I looking at? You're looking at the other side of the ledger, what comes in and what gets moved before it ever becomes a disbursement." He turned another page. "The fund holds property, warehouses, mostly, 3 parcels off Summer Street, some land in Braintree. Arthur bought all of it in the 90s, and it sat there appreciating for 30 years. Starting 5 years ago, it began to move. Sold, refinanced, sold again, and every time, the proceeds went to a management company for handling before they came back to the fund. How much came back? Most of it. Not all." Theo laid a single sheet on the table, with 3 lines on it. $41 million over 5 years. It left the foundation through 3 companies, all of them incorporated in Delaware, all of them formed within about 90 days of each other. Elena leaned forward to look at the sheet. "What are they?" "Nothing," Theo said. "That's the point. A Delaware entity costs a couple $100 to stand up, and it doesn't have to tell you who owns it. No employees, no offices. There's a registered agent's address in Wilmington, and I counted 1,100 other companies at that same address." He tapped the paper. "The money went in, and it went out again, and it went out to accounts I can't follow from here. And it did all that inside legitimate-looking property transactions that any auditor would sign off on if he didn't go looking underneath." 4,000 families, Dominic said. "They'd never feel it," Theo said. "That's the design. You never touch the money going out the front door, because that's the money people notice. You take it off the top of what's coming in the back, and everybody keeps getting their check, and everybody keeps standing up at the scholarship dinner." He was quiet a second. Whoever did this understood something most thieves don't. Nobody audits generosity. Dominic put both hands on the back of a chair. "You can prove it? I can prove $41 million left the foundation. I can prove it went to 3 shells. What I can't do yet is put a hand on those shells and show you whose it is. And until I can, this is a story, not a case." Theo pulled the laptop toward him. "But the shells have to file. Delaware doesn't ask much, but it asks for something. Every one of these has to name an officer of record on the annual report, and it has to be a human being with a name." He turned the screen around. It was a scanned filing, a plain form, a state seal at the top, and a signature block at the bottom. The first 2 name a corporate secretary out of a service bureau. Boilerplate means nothing. The third one names a person. Elena was already reading it upside down. She got very still. Under Director of Record, on a form filed with the state of Delaware, was the name Daniel Marsh, with an address in Everett. Elena set the glass down without a sound and said, "He never had an address in Everett in his life." "There's more," Theo said, and he was watching her when he said it, and his voice had gone careful. "That's the filing from 4 years ago. There's another one after it, and another one after that." He scrolled down twice and stopped. Same name, same signature block. Filed the 11th of March this year. 2 years and 6 months after Danny Marsh was buried in Malden. The answer came back on the 18th, and it didn't come in the night, and nobody's window got broken. It came by certified mail, on a Sunday, delivered to the house in Gloucester by a courier who had Elena sign for it. Catherine Boyle read it twice standing in the kitchen. The Vale Family Foundation, acting through counsel, had filed a civil complaint in Suffolk Superior Court against Elena Marsh, alleging that she had knowingly held herself out as a member of the Vale family for the purpose of obtaining financial benefit, that she had accessed foundation records without authorization during a period when she was not an employee, and that she was presently attempting to assert a claim against a charitable trust to which she had no lawful connection. The complaint asked for an accounting and an injunction. It did not ask for money. "That's the tell," Catherine said. "They don't want a judgment. They want a case number sitting next to your name." On the 20th, it was in the papers, not the front page. A business column. 140 words. No byline. Under the heading, Charity Fights Claim on Longshoremen's Fund. It said that the Vale Family Foundation had moved to protect 4,000 beneficiary families from what its counsel described as an opportunistic claim by a woman who left the family home in the spring and returned in October, pregnant, after learning the terms of a trust deadline. It quoted no one by name. It printed Elena's, twice. Dominic read it at the kitchen table and set the paper down and didn't say anything for a while. And when he did, his voice was so level, it frightened her more than shouting would have. "Every word in that is true," he said. "That's why it works." Elena picked it up herself. She read the whole thing through, and then she folded it in half and put it in the recycling under the sink. And she said, "I've been called worse by better." But she stopped eating around noon that day, and Dominic noticed, and he didn't mention it. The third thing came on the 22nd, at 11 in the morning, and it was a woman in a raincoat with a canvas bag over her shoulder, standing at the front door with an identification card held up at eye level. Department of Children and Families. She was maybe 40. She said her name and said it again when Elena didn't catch it, and she asked if she could come in, and she said, before anything else, that she wanted to be clear that this was not an emergency response and that no one was being accused of anything. She sat at the kitchen table and took out a folder. A 51. A report had been filed 9 days earlier, screened in on the 19th, and assigned to her. The reporter was anonymous. That was permitted under the statute, and she couldn't tell them anything about who it was. And Elena believed her when she said she didn't know either. The allegation was of neglect, prospective, concerning a child not yet born. The woman read the particulars out loud in a flat, professional voice because she had to. That the expectant mother had no current employment, that she had been terminated from her last position in October and had no income of record, that she had no permanent address, having resided the previous 7 months in an unregistered basement unit in Revere, that she carried no health insurance and had received prenatal care exclusively at a free clinic, that the child's father had a criminal record, including a conviction from 2013, that the mother had been absent from the marital home for 7 months, under circumstances the reporter characterized as unexplained. Then she looked up and said, "Ma'am, can you tell me if any of that is inaccurate?" Elena sat with her hands on the table. She was 37 weeks and 2 days, and she went through it, item by item, in her head, looking for one thing she could push back on, one sentence she could put a finger on and say, "No, that's a lie." There wasn't one. It was all true. Every line of it was true. And it had been assembled by somebody who knew every step she'd taken since April. And it had been written in the voice of concern, and it had been handed to a woman in a raincoat, whose entire job was to take concern seriously. "No," Elena said. "It's accurate." "Okay." The woman wrote something down. She wasn't unkind. She wasn't anything. She asked to see where Elena was sleeping, and Elena took her upstairs. And the woman looked at the room and asked whether the house was rented or owned, and by whom. She asked if there was a car available. She asked whether Elena had a plan for the first 6 weeks after the birth, and Elena said the hospital was arranged, and the woman wrote that down too and asked who was paying for it. And Elena heard herself say the name Vivian Kessler out loud in that upstairs hallway, and watched the woman write it down. Downstairs, Dominic stood with his back against the counter and said nothing at all, because he'd understood inside the first 90 seconds that there was not one thing in this world he could do about it. He couldn't buy it. He couldn't move it. He couldn't lean on a woman doing her job honestly out of a folder. And the terrible part, the part that stayed with him afterward, was that she was right to be there. On the doorstep, the woman turned back. "I'll be in touch within 30 days, she said. "Please don't move without telling me. 12 days to the 3rd of November. The appointment on the 23rd was at 2 o'clock, and Elena was 40 minutes early because the traffic north of the tunnel had been kinder than she'd planned for, and she was sitting alone in the waiting room with her coat across her lap when Vivian Kessler came in and sat down in the chair beside her. She had a leather folder under one arm. She didn't ask if she could sit. She reached over and took Elena's hand and held it, and she said, "How's your blood pressure been?" And Elena told her. And Vivian nodded and said, "That's on the high side of all right," and neither of them said anything for a minute. There was a woman across the room with a toddler and a magazine, and a receptionist behind glass, and the small television in the corner with the sound off. I'm not going to insult you, Vivian said at last. You know I filed that complaint. My name isn't on it, but you know it's mine. And you're too smart for me to sit here and pretend otherwise, so I won't. She opened the folder on her knee and took out 2 things and set them on the low table in front of them, side by side, the way a person lays out a hand of cards they've already decided to lose with. One was a check, drawn on a private bank in Boston, made out to Elena Marsh, in the amount of $2 million. The other was a property file with photographs clipped to the front of it, a small white house with a tiled roof and a lemon tree in the yard, an address in Santa Barbara, California, the deed already prepared, and the transfer taxes already calculated. Free and clear, Vivian said. No mortgage. The taxes are endowed for 20 years, so nobody can ever take it from you for money. The check is yours the day you sign, and there's no clawback in it, and Catherine can read every word of it and tell you I'm not lying. Elena looked at the table and didn't touch anything. What do you want? One thing, Vivian said. The baby doesn't take the name Vale. Elena turned and looked at her then, and Vivian looked back, and there wasn't a single hard line anywhere in that woman's face. Let me say the rest, and then you can tell me to go to hell, and I'll go. She kept hold of Elena's hand while she said it. I have lived in that house for 20 years, and I want you to understand what I'm actually offering you, because it isn't money. She was quiet a moment, gathering it. In that house, when the doorbell rings after 9 at night, a grown man puts his hand somewhere before he answers it. Every time. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's ever said the word out loud in my presence in 20 years. But a child sees it. A child sees it the first year and doesn't know what it means, and sees it the 5th year and starts to know, and by the time that child is 8 years old, the sound of a doorbell has done something to him that no amount of anything later on will undo. Her voice didn't rise. That was the worst of it. I raised a boy in that house. I did everything I knew how to do. I sat with him when he couldn't sleep. And I made up reasons for why the cars were in the driveway. And I told myself that love in the house was worth more than what was outside the door. She stopped for a second. He's 28 years old and he doesn't return my calls. He doesn't come at Christmas. He carries a different last name than mine because of a decision I made when he was small. And I made that decision because even then, some part of me already knew. She looked down at the check on the table. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to give you the one thing nobody offered me. A door out. Before the child is old enough to remember any of it. Elena sat with her hand still inside that woman's hand and felt the whole thing land on her at once. The $214, the crib somebody else's baby had used, the woman in the raincoat writing in a folder at her kitchen table, and the 12 days, and the fact that not one line of that report had been false. She looked at the lemon tree in the photograph, and she thought about a driveway with no cars in it. She reached out. There was a pen on the table beside the folder, and her fingers went to it, and they closed around it, and she felt the weight of it in her hand. Vivian didn't move. Elena set the pen back down, not because she'd decided, because her hand was shaking and she didn't want it seen. I need to think, she said. Of course you do. Vivian gathered up the folder and stood, and she put her hand for a second on Elena's shoulder, and she was already turning toward the door when she said the last of it, softly, the way a woman says something she's been carrying around for a while. Take all the time you need, sweetheart. Mia is going to have a different life. That's all I want. And she was gone through the glass door and out into the parking lot before Elena's mind caught up with her ears. Nobody knew that name. She had written it once, in pencil, on the inside cover of a spiral notebook, and she had put that notebook under the mattress in a basement room in Revere, and she had never said it aloud to a living soul. Elena sat there for a long moment with the sound of the television going on without her. Then she picked up the check off the table and tore it in half, and in half again, and set the pieces down where it had been. She told him on the evening of the 25th, at the kitchen table in Gloucester, with the tide out and the light going. There's one more thing I never told you. He waited. The night I left, I didn't walk to a bus. Somebody drove me. He didn't move. It was Nico. Nico Ferrara came up from Boston an hour and 10 minutes later. He came alone, and he came fast. And when he walked into that kitchen and saw the two of them sitting there, he stopped in the doorway and took his coat off and hung it on the back of a chair. And Dominic understood that he'd known this evening was coming for 7 months and had rehearsed the walk from the door to the table. Sit down, Dominic said. He sat. You drove her. Yes. Why? Nico put both hands flat on the table in front of him. Because I got a call, he said. That's the beginning of it. But it isn't the beginning of the beginning. So let me tell you the whole thing in order, and then you can do whatever you want with me. He said it evenly. He didn't ask for anything first, and he didn't say he was sorry, and he never once raised his voice above the level a man uses to read a statement into a record. 2 years ago, on the 6th of September, I got a call at 11:40 at night. It was your voice. Your number came up, and the caller gave the code, the 4-word confirmation, the one that changes the first Monday of every month and that 3 people in this world have ever had. He paused, and the instruction was a name, Daniel Marsh. Elena's hands came together on top of her belly and stayed there. I didn't question it. In 11 years, I've never questioned one of those. That was the whole point of the code, that you don't question it. That's what it's for. He looked straight ahead at the middle of the table. I picked him up outside his apartment. I told him you wanted to talk about his sister, and he got in the car with me like a man going to lunch. I drove him to a lot off Everett Avenue in Chelsea. There were 3 men there in a gray sedan, and I didn't know any of them. And I've thought about that every day since, because in 11 years I have known every man at every meeting I've ever driven to. He stopped for a second. I handed him over, and I got back in my car and I drove home. Nobody said anything. 3 days later, he was found on Route 16 and the report said hit and run, and I sat in the back of that church in Malden and watched you hold her hand at the rail. Elena was looking at the table. She wasn't crying. She hadn't made a sound. I never asked you about it, Nico said. Not once in 2 years. Because a man who asks his boss why is a man who thinks his boss owes him an answer. And I didn't think that. I thought whatever Danny Marsh had done, he'd done it, and you knew and I didn't. And that was the arrangement I'd signed up for at 19. He took a breath. Then in March I got the second call. Dominic's hands had gone still on the table. Same voice, Nico said. Same number came up. Same code, correct for that month. And this time the name was Elena. The refrigerator hummed and shut off. And I stood in my own kitchen and I couldn't make it fit. Because whatever I'd let myself believe about her brother, I couldn't believe that. So I sat down on the floor of my kitchen for about 2 hours. And then I got in the car and I drove to Prince Street. And I woke her up at 3 in the morning. And I told her she had to get out of that house. Elena spoke for the first time, quietly, to the tabletop. He gave me $1,100 and a name to use, and he drove me to a motel in Salem, and he told me not to call anyone. Not anyone. He said if I called even once, he wouldn't be able to keep me alive. And you reported her missing, Dominic said. I reported that I'd lost her. Nico's voice didn't change. And then I ran the search. 7 months. 11 men, every account, every camera, every hospital and pharmacy and utility hookup in 3 counties. And I ran it hard, because if I hadn't run it hard, you'd have given it to somebody else and somebody else would have found her inside a week. He finally looked up. Every Monday I sat across from you and told you we had nothing. That's the part I can't put anywhere. Not the driving, the Mondays. Dominic sat back in his chair. Why didn't you come to me? Nico looked at him for a long moment. Because it was your voice, he said. It was your number and your code. Twice. 2 years apart. There isn't a man alive who could have told me that call didn't come from you. And then he said the last of it. And he said it the same flat way he'd said all the rest, which was what made it land the way it did. I spent 7 months hiding your wife from you. And every one of those days I believed I was hiding her from the man who wanted her gone. For a long while, nobody at that table said anything at all. The tide had gone all the way out and the window over the sink had turned into a black mirror, and Dominic sat looking at the middle of the table the way a man looks at a thing that isn't there. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than usual, and slower. Say the code out loud. Nico looked up. What? The 4 words. From September, 2 years ago. Say them. Nico said them. Dominic nodded once. That's right, he said. That was mine. Then he sat back. 11 years, he said. 11 years of the same rule, drilled into every man who's ever worked for me. You get the voice and the code. You move. You don't ask. You don't confirm. You don't call anybody back to check, because calling back is a leak, and a leak is how men end up in a courtroom. He was quiet a second. I built that. Nobody handed it to me. I sat in a room in 1999 and wrote it down. Nico said. It was a good rule. It was a perfect rule. Dominic said. That's the trouble with it. He put his hands on the table and looked at them. A rule like that only ever has one weakness, and the weakness is the whole design. It runs on one voice. Anybody who can get that voice gets the whole thing. Every man, every car, every door in this city. He looked up. Somebody sat in a room for years recording me. And then they didn't need my men. They just needed my sound. Elena had not moved in 10 minutes. I didn't kill your brother, Dominic said to her. I want to say that once and then never again, because you'll believe it or you won't, and it isn't mine to argue. He paused, but I don't get to stop there, because a man walked out of his apartment and got into a car that came from me. He got in without a word, because it came from me. He wasn't afraid, because it came from me. And every single thing that made that possible, I made. He stopped for a moment. I spent 20 years building a machine that would do exactly what it was told, without ever asking who was doing the telling. Somebody found the handle. And what they did with it, they did with my machine, and my name, and my men. That isn't bad luck. That's the bill. Elena finally spoke, and her voice was almost nothing. You'd have been in that car with him, if you'd been the one who called. Yes, he'd have gotten in either way. He would have, Dominic said. That's the part I keep coming back around to. He turned to Nico. Stand up. Nico stood. Elena's hand went to the edge of the table. You have a wife and a daughter in East Boston, Dominic said. Go home to them. Nico didn't move. That's it? That's not it. That isn't anywhere near it. There's an accounting coming for you, and you and I both know what it is and where it happens, and it isn't in this kitchen, and it isn't tonight, and it isn't with my hands. Dominic looked at him. 11 years. You followed the rule I gave you. I'm not going to break your life for obeying me. I should have asked, Nico said. Yes, you should have. Dominic held his eyes. And you couldn't, because I spent 11 years teaching you that asking was the one thing a loyal man never does. So take that home with you tonight, because I'm taking it too, and it doesn't get lighter. He waited a beat. From now on, there's no code in this organization. Nobody moves on a phone call. Not one man, not one time. And if my voice comes down a line telling you otherwise, you hang up and you drive to wherever I am and you look at my face. Nico stood there another second. Then he took his coat off the back of the chair and went out through the door. And they heard his car turn over in the gravel and pull away. And the kitchen was quiet again. Elena sat very still. She'd come into that room expecting something else. She'd known exactly what she was doing when she said the name Nico out loud at that table, and some cold part of her had wanted to watch it happen, had wanted to see what this man did with a person who'd handed her brother into a car, and she'd told herself she wanted it because it would be proof of something. And instead, she'd watched him send a man home to his daughter, and then say the worst thing about himself out loud with no one in the room to make him. She looked at him for a long moment. It was not forgiveness. Nothing in her had shifted anywhere near that, and it wouldn't. Not that night, and not for a long time after. But she was looking at him differently, and she knew she was, and she didn't like it, and couldn't stop it. You've never once said you were sorry, she said. No, why not? Dominic sat with his hands on the table. Because sorry is a thing you say when you want to be finished with it, he said. I'm not going to be finished with it. It took Theo Lindquist 8 days, and it didn't take a computer. He worked backward from the 60-cycle hum. That kind of hum comes from a room wired a certain way and left that way for decades, and it doesn't show up in a studio built after about 1985, so he made a list of every commercial room in Greater Boston old enough to carry it and started calling. Most were gone. 2 had been turned into apartments. On the 28th of October, he found a woman working the afternoon board at a small radio station in Quincy, 400 watts, a signal that didn't reach the far side of the harbor, and when he said the words audio editing and cash and 2 years ago into the phone, there was a silence on the other end that went on long enough that he knew before she said a word. Catherine Boyle went with him. They sat with the woman in a break room behind the studio with a vending machine humming in the corner, and she talked for 40 minutes without either of them having to push. She'd spent most of her working life in a room on the second floor of a building off Beacon Street that had been a recording studio since the 1960s, and she'd cut commercials and voiceovers and station promos in it until the owner died and the building was sold. She'd been out of work 11 weeks when a woman came and found her. She didn't call, she said. She came to the door. Older lady, very well dressed, very pleasant. The way people are pleasant when they've never had to be anything else. She'd brought a portable drive with a great deal of material on it, and a typed page with the sentence she wanted. And she'd said the job was for a private legal matter, and that discretion was part of what she was paying for. Cash, half up front. Catherine asked how much. $20,000, the woman said, for 11 seconds. She'd taken it. She said that part without any excuses attached to it. She'd been 11 weeks without a paycheck, and she'd taken it. And she'd sat in a room and built those 11 seconds out of pieces of a man's voice from different years. And she'd known while she was doing it that nobody pays $20,000 in cash for something that's going to be used kindly. I finished it on a Thursday, she said. She came back Friday and I gave her the file and she paid me the other half and she left. And that night I couldn't sleep. Theo said, "Did you delete the source material?" She looked at him. No. She'd gone back into the studio the following week, before the building sold, and she'd made a copy of everything the woman had given her. All of it. The whole drive. Untouched, every raw recording exactly as it had come to her, and she'd put it in a fireproof box in her sister's basement in Weymouth, and left it there for 2 years, and never once opened it. Why? Catherine asked. The woman turned her coffee cup around on the table. Because I've been doing this 31 years, and I know what a cut sounds like, she said. And I figured someday somebody was going to come asking. And I wanted to be the one who could show them what it looked like before. Catherine took out a legal pad. She explained, plainly and without softening any of it, what the next several weeks would look like. An affidavit, a deposition, the chance of being called in front of a grand jury, and the certainty that the other side would go through her life looking for a reason to say she was lying. The woman listened all the way through. Then she said, "I'll do it. But I want it in writing that somebody's protecting me, because the lady who came to my door had money, and people with money don't come after you the way you think they will. They come after your license and your credit and your sister." "You'll have it by Monday," Catherine said, in writing, signed by me. On the drive back, Theo called Gloucester and got no answer, and called again 20 minutes later and got no answer, and it was Dominic who called him back at 4:10 on the 31st, from a moving car, and his voice wasn't right. Elena had gotten up from the kitchen table around 2 in the afternoon and told him the light in the room had gone strange, that there were spots in it. And she'd said it calmly, the way she said everything, and then she'd put her hand flat on the counter and stayed there. He'd driven her to the community hospital 15 minutes down the road because it was closer. They'd taken her blood pressure twice, and a nurse had gone out of the room without saying anything and come back with a doctor, and after that things had moved very fast. Severe preeclampsia, 38 weeks and 3 days. The doctor said the words carefully, and then said the ones that mattered, which were that they weren't equipped for what might be coming, and that she needed to be somewhere that was. There was an ambulance in the bay in 11 minutes. Dominic followed it down. Route 128, in the dark, with his hands at 10 and 2, and the taillights ahead of him the whole way. 39 miles, and it was the first time in his adult life that he'd driven anywhere in that city behind somebody else, and had no say at all in how fast they went. They took her back at 1:30 in the morning at Massachusetts General, and a woman in scrubs told him where to wait, and that was the last thing anybody said to him for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He stood in a corridor on the 3rd floor, with a row of chairs along one wall and a vending machine at the far end, and a set of double doors he wasn't allowed through. He didn't sit down at first. He'd been standing about 20 minutes when it came to him. All at once, exactly where he was. There was no one to call. There was no one in that building to be leaned on. No name to drop. No envelope that would move anything by 1 inch in either direction. Every difficult thing in his adult life had been solved by finding out who decided it, and going to that person. And behind those doors, there was no such person. The only people who could help her were already helping her, and they were doing it whether he was standing in that hallway or not. And it would have gone exactly the same if he'd been a man who pumped gas in Everett. He'd never once in 37 years been that. Somewhere after 2 o'clock, a young woman came out and sat down in the chairs across from him. She had a hospital bracelet on and a plastic cup of ice chips, and she was maybe 22. She said, "Are you waiting on somebody?" And he said, "My wife." And she said, "First one?" And he said yes. She told him her own was in the nursery, a boy, 7 hours old, and that she'd come out to walk because they'd told her to walk. She talked for about 10 minutes. She talked about how her mother had driven up from Fall River and gotten lost in the parking garage for 45 minutes, and about how nobody tells you that your hands shake afterward. And she asked him what they were having, and he said he didn't know. And she said, "Oh, you'll know soon." and laughed at him a little. She had no idea in the world who he was. She'd have said the same things to anybody sitting in that chair. When she got up to go back, she said, "It's going to be fine, you know. They're really good here." And she patted his arm on the way past, the way a person pats a stranger. And she went down the corridor and around the corner, and he never saw her again, and never learned her name. He sat down after that. At 4 on the morning of the 1st of November, a nurse came through the double doors and said, "Mr. Vale, you can come back." Elena was awake. Her face was swollen and her lips were dry, and she looked at him and said, "She's all right," before she said anything else. 5 pounds, 12 ounces, 19 inches. She had a full head of dark hair, and she was small enough that the hat they'd put on her came down over her eyebrows, and Elena held her against her chest with one hand under her and looked down at her, and Dominic stood at the side of the bed and didn't touch anything for a long time. It was Catherine Boyle, who came at 9 that morning with the folder, and she came early on purpose. She'd already been on the phone with the clerk's office by then. "I need to explain something to you both, and I need you to hear it all the way through before either of you says anything," she said. "In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when a married woman gives birth, her husband is presumed by law to be the father of the child, and no one has to sign anything for that to be true. It happens on its own. It is one of the oldest and steadiest presumptions in the law of that state." "It doesn't apply to you," Catherine said. "Why not?" "Because of what's sitting in the probate and family court." That complaint from May had never gone anywhere and never would, but it existed, and its existence meant that the marital status of Elena Marsh and Dominic Vale was, as of that morning, a contested question with a docket number attached to it. A hospital clerk looking at a screen would see a pending matter and would not enter the presumption. "So we do it the other way," Catherine said, and took the form out of the folder. A voluntary acknowledgement of parentage. Both parents sign, in front of a notary, in the hospital, and the father's name goes on the birth certificate, and the child is his in law from that moment. It's a single page. It's designed to be simple. It's meant for exactly this. They signed it at 10 in the morning on the 1st of November, with a hospital notary standing at the foot of the bed, and Elena bracing the pen against a clipboard, and Catherine walked it downstairs herself and filed it, and got the stamped copy in her hand. At 4 that afternoon, counsel for the Vale Family Foundation filed a motion in Suffolk County challenging the validity of that acknowledgement, on the grounds that it had been executed while the parties' marital status was under active dispute, and requesting that its effect be stayed pending a hearing. The earliest available hearing date was the 9th of December, 2 days to the 3rd of November, and that same afternoon, Vivian Kessler called an emergency meeting of the Foundation Board. The board met on the 11th floor of the Vale Maritime Building in the Seaport at 9 o'clock at night on the 3rd of November, which is not an hour when charitable boards meet, and every person in that room understood why they were there. The item on the table was a sale of the Foundation's operating interest in a section of the Conley Terminal to a shipping group out of Rotterdam, and it had been negotiated over 11 days and priced at a number nobody argued with, and the closing was set for 11:55 that night. Theo had explained it in the car. Once that instrument executed, $41 million of history would pass into the accounting of 3 separate jurisdictions, and the trail would not be reconstructed by anyone, ever, no matter how many years or lawyers were thrown at it. They were stopped in the lobby at 9:20. The head of building security was polite about it. He had a printed list, and Elena Marsh wasn't on it. And when Catherine Boyle said the words "wife of the chief executive," he turned his screen around, not unkindly, and showed her the pending docket in Suffolk County. On paper, that night, Elena wasn't legally the wife of anybody. She stood in that marble lobby with Mia asleep against her shoulder, 2 days old, wrapped in a blanket from the hospital, and she didn't say a word. Catherine argued for 11 minutes. She was still arguing when the elevator opened behind them, and Theo Lindquist walked out of it carrying a document box. He'd come down from the 11th floor. He'd been sitting in that meeting for 20 minutes as a shareholder of record of Vale Maritime, a fact nobody in his family had thought about in 4 years, and he'd said nothing at all while the board went through the first 2 items. "They're upstairs," he said. "Come on." Security let them into the elevator behind him because nobody had told them what to do about a shareholder. The room went quiet when the doors opened. Vivian Kessler was at the head of the table with a pen in her hand, and she looked up and saw Elena in the doorway with the baby, and something crossed her face that no one in that room could have named. Theo set the box on the table and started laying it out. He laid out the transfer history of 3 parcels of foundation property over 5 years. He laid out the formation records of 3 Delaware entities and the receipts of $41 million moving through them. He laid out the annual filing bearing the name Daniel Marsh, and beside it, a death certificate from the city of Everett dated 2 years and 6 months earlier, and he set them close enough together that no one had to be told what they were looking at. He laid out the affidavit of a woman in Quincy, sworn and notarized, and a portable drive containing 2 years of uncut source recordings. And last, he laid down a single stapled document, and he said what it was before anyone could pick it up. That's a proffer statement given by Nico Ferrara to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. He walked in and gave it yesterday morning, voluntarily, with counsel. He hasn't asked anybody in this room for anything. Nobody moved. Then Theo said the last part, and he said it looking at his mother. One more thing, because I want the board to hear the dates in order. The first transfer out of the foundation had cleared 5 years ago in March. Arthur Vale Sr. had been alive then. He'd also, by then, been 18 months into a diagnosis that 2 of his physicians had documented and that his family had told no one about. And for the last 2 years of his life, the signature on foundation instruments had been made by his wife under a power of attorney. She had never once disclosed to the board. Every one of those transfers is signed Arthur Vale, Theo said. None of them are his hand. He put down the last page. Daniel Marsh was a staff accountant on the foundation books. He asked one question in writing. In August, 2 years ago, about a property sale in Braintree. He was the only person in 9 years who ever asked. Elena stood in the doorway and didn't make a sound. Vivian set down her pen. She didn't deny anything. She looked around that table at 11 people she had hosted in her home, and then she stood up, slowly, and rested her fingertips on the wood. I came into that house 20 years ago, she said. I want to tell you what I did in it, since nobody's ever asked. She said it quietly, and no one interrupted her. I answered the telephone at 2 in the morning. I sat in a church at 4 different funerals and told 4 different widows something comforting. I stood in my own kitchen at 6 a.m. and told a detective, to his face, that my husband had been home all night. I cleaned things off floors. I have made 20 years of that man's life presentable to the world, and there is not one page of it anywhere with my name on it. She looked down at the table, and when he died, I sat in a lawyer's office and listened to 11 pages of a will, and the whole of what he left me was one word. Interim. She stopped. I didn't steal from those families. I took what was mine off the top of what came in, and I made sure not one check to one widow was ever late. And I would have gone on doing it for 20 more years, and every one of you would have kept applauding me at the dinner. She looked up. The word he gave me was temporary. I decided it wasn't. The clock at the end of the room read 11:31. At 20 to midnight, Catherine Boyle came into that room with a single sheet of paper in her hand and set it in front of the board's outside counsel. She had spent 9 hours that day in the probate and family court in Suffolk County with an emergency motion, a certified copy of the acknowledgement of parentage, and the sworn statement of a clerk who had accepted a filing in May from a courier holding a payment receipt with a name on it. A judge had signed the order at 4:20 in the afternoon. The complaint filed on the 11th of May was struck as fraudulently procured. The marital record of Elena Marsh and Dominic Vale was restored as of that date, and the acknowledgement executed at the hospital on the 1st of November was declared valid and in full effect. The motion challenging it was denied as moot. There was a living lineal heir of Dominic Vale, and there had been since 12 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 1st of November, and the clock on the wall crossed midnight, while the board's counsel was still reading the second paragraph. Vivian Kessler's interim chairmanship did not become permanent. It simply ended. Nobody in that room said anything for a while, and then the Rotterdam sale died on the table for want of emotion, and it never came back. What Dominic did next surprised every person who worked for him. He didn't remove anyone from the board, and he didn't make a single telephone call that night. On the 4th of November, he instructed Catherine to open the complete records of the Vale Family Foundation, 9 years of them, to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts, without conditions, and he did it knowing exactly what else was in those files, and whose name was on it. He signed the foundation over to an independent board of 7 within the month, and he wrote into the instrument that 3 of those 7 seats would be held by working representatives elected by the longshoremen themselves, and that no member of the Vale family could ever hold more than one. And when Nico Ferrara came to the house in Gloucester to say what he had to say, Dominic walked him out to his car and shook his hand at the door of it and let him drive himself down to Post Office Square to keep his own appointment. Vivian was indicted before the end of the month on charges of wire fraud, forgery, and misuse of charitable assets, with a further count that the office declined to describe in its press release, and she left that boardroom on the night of the 3rd of November, with her coat over her arm and her chin up, and not one person at that table stood when she went past. 3 months later, in the middle of February, none of it was finished. Dominic was 11 weeks into a conditional cooperation agreement, and every week there was another room, and another table, and another set of questions, and the freight company was being sold off in pieces to satisfy things he'd never expected to answer for. He was going to lose a great deal. He knew he was, and he had stopped pretending otherwise sometime in December. Theo Lindquist took the chief financial officer's chair at the new foundation and moved his office down to the piers, and the first thing he did in it was order a full audit of everything his mother had ever signed. Elena had not put her ring back on. It sat in a dish on the windowsill in the kitchen in Gloucester, and neither of them touched it, and neither of them talked about it. When the birth certificate came in the mail in the second week of December, Dominic opened it at the kitchen table and read it, and then sat there holding it for a long time. Mother, Elena Marsh. Child, Mia Vale. He didn't say anything about it. He put it in the drawer with the clinic records and went out to the car. And on a night in February at 3 a.m, he was walking the length of that kitchen with his daughter against his shoulder, 3 months old and wide awake and furious about it, patting her back in a slow rhythm he'd worked out sometime around Christmas, with a wet patch spreading across the shoulder of his shirt that he'd stopped noticing weeks ago. He was humming something with no tune to it. Elena stood in the doorway in the dark and watched them for a long while before either of them knew she was there. She didn't say that she forgave him. She wasn't going to say that. Not that night, and maybe not for a long time, and he had never once asked her to. She watched her daughter's small hand open and close against the collar of his shirt, and after a minute she said, "Set your alarm. She feeds at 6. And Dominic Vale, who had built half his life on the certainty that no one would ever tell him what to do, said, "All right," and kept walking her up and down that kitchen floor. Here is what this story leaves us with. Power on its own doesn't destroy people, and neither does money, and neither does a name that makes a whole city lower its voice. What destroys people is a room where nobody is allowed to ask a question, because sooner or later, somebody will learn to speak in a voice that room has been trained to obey. Danny Marsh died because he asked one question in writing, and he was the only person in 9 years who did. And Elena spent 7 months invisible in a basement in Revere, not because anyone was cruel to her, but because the people around her had simply stopped looking, and respect for another human being begins with the ordinary decision to actually see them, at the counter, at the door, in the room, before life makes it impossible to pretend you didn't. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like, and share it with someone you care about, so we can keep bringing you stories like this one every day. We would truly love to hear from you in the comments. Did any part of this remind you of something in your own life? Of a person you stopped seeing? Or of a question you wish somebody had asked in time? Tell us honestly, because we read every word, and the things you share from your heart are what make this channel what it is. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a peaceful mind, and quiet happiness in your days. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.